This is my first video update coming to you from a sunny, but also a rainy Athens, Greece on this Tuesday morning. It is a light rain here. We're going to get through this video, but the sun is also out. So it's kind of nice, actually, to have a little bit of rain and the sun hitting you. Anyway, I've got my coffee in hand. I went to a new coffee shop here in downtown Athens, and they gave me this coffee cup, which reads Girl Power. It reads Girl Power. And this coffee cup, actually, the fact that it says Girl Power is very fitting given today's clown world. Very, very fitting given the clown world that I'm going to talk about at the end of my video. So Girl Power, that is what my clown world is going to be about. Let's talk now about some news. And I'm going to read a Bloomberg article, which provides the Biden White House, I believe it provides the Biden White House with an off-ramp from Project Ukraine if the Biden White House should decide to take that off-ramp. I don't think they will, but the Bloomberg article does give Biden a victory in Ukraine, a full spectrum victory in Ukraine, and it gives him that off-ramp should he wish to take it from Project Ukraine. And it provides the Biden White House with a way to ditch Project Ukraine onto the lap of Europe. And let me put an Economist magazine cover on the screen right now. And this is the magazine cover from The Economist for November 26th to December 2nd, 2022. So this is the most recent cover from The Economist. The Economist is a neocon, neoliberal magazine to the max. I mean, they are super duper neocon, and they absolutely despise, they absolutely hate Russia, Russians, and Vladimir Putin. This is a magazine that absolutely despises Russia. And the cover reads, Frozen Out, How the World is Leaving Europe Behind. How the world is leaving Europe behind. And you can see the icicles right there on the European continent. How the world is leaving Europe behind. How the U.S. is leaving Europe behind. Maybe that's what they mean to say. But anyway, let's get to this Bloomberg article. And the title of this Bloomberg article is Ukraine's Victories May Become a Problem for the U.S. The byline reads, Washington has been a big winner from Russia's fiasco, but a lengthy stalemate could become a huge burden. Now, this article, it paints the Biden White House and their foreign policy team as victorious in this Ukraine conflict. Absolutely full spectrum victorious in this Ukraine conflict. It paints Biden as a type of, let's say, a 5D foreign policy chess master. And it gives Biden a victory. It allows the Biden White House to say, we have achieved full victory over Russia, over Putin. We've got the European Union under our thumb. We've demolished the Russian military. We've embarrassed Russia. And we can now move on to other projects. Perhaps Iran, perhaps Saudi Arabia, perhaps Taiwan. This article gives them the ability to declare a win, a big win, if they want to take it. So let me read you what this article says and how they lay things out. And there's some pretty creative writing in this article as well. I have to hand it to the author of this Bloomberg piece. And the article begins by outlining the three big victories that the Ukraine military achieved in September. And this is how this article describes these victories. And the big one, of course, is Kherson. And the article says that with 20,000 Russian troops holding a vulnerable beachhead on the right bank of the Dnipro River, near where it flows into the Black Sea, the Ukrainians pounced using US-supplied high-mobility artillery rocket systems and other weapons to isolate Russian forces and then grinding them down with a methodical offensive. And then grinding them down with a methodical offensive. So that is how it describes the victory in Kherson. The article fails to mention that the Russians, under the new command of Surovikin, voluntarily pulled out of Kherson. Equipment and troops 100% intact. And the article also fails to mention that the Ukraine military is now having a hard time holding down Kherson. And so they too are in the early stages of some sort of evacuation from Kherson. So the article fails to mention that this Ukraine grinding down of the Russian forces was actually Russia voluntarily leaving the West Bank of the area. The article then talks about the second big success in September, which was the liberation of Kharkiv, and it calls that a successful Ukraine military offensive, which led to the liberation of large swaths of territory. Once again, the article fails to mention that Russia voluntarily pulled out of Kharkiv as well. And finally, the third big victory for the Ukraine military in September, according to Bloomberg, is the severing of the Kerch Bridge from Russia to Crimea. And this was actually a terrorist act which killed 2 civilians, knocked out the Kerch Bridge for about 8 hours tops, and did absolutely nothing to benefit the Ukraine military. It didn't stop Russian supply lines. It didn't slow down the Russian operation, the SMO. All it was a way to score some PR and optics victories, put out some silly postage stamps, have Ukrainian citizens take pictures in front of those postage stamps. And then what happened? Then Russia decided to launch a massive missile and drone campaign throughout all of Ukraine, knocking out Ukraine's entire electric grid. That's what the Kerch Bridge terrorist attack accomplished. And correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, but I don't think the Ukraine government, the Zelensky regime, I don't think they have officially taken responsibility for this attack on the Kerch Bridge. I know they've sent out tweets and they've kind of danced around the subject of this being some sort of Ukraine military project, but the government has stopped short of saying that they committed this terrorist act against Russia and against the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. So, okay, Bloomberg puts this in there. I understand why they put this in there, to kind of round things out and give the impression that Ukraine is demolishing Russia, and they're even striking out at Crimea. That's the impression that they want to give. You got to remember, they have a Crimea fixation. The collective West, they're absolutely fixated on Crimea. But to call the Kerch Bridge attack a victory, all right. Well, let's move on then. The article then talks about the many challenges that the Biden administration now faces, given the overwhelming victories of the Ukraine military from September onwards. And it says that these are the key challenges facing the Biden White House. First, is Ukraine headed for further gains or a grinding deadlock? On the one hand, the liberation of Kherson has brought Ukrainian forces within HIMARS range of Russia's remaining supply lines into Crimea, while troops freed up by this victory can prepare for new offensives elsewhere. Remember, their Crimea fixation. They have this Crimea fixation. So HIMARS are now in range to strike out at Crimea. That is a challenge. On the other hand, Ukraine's battle-bruised army may need arrest. It may also face stiffer resistance as Russian forces increase their numbers, thanks to an influx of conscripts, shorten their supply lines, prepare trenches and other layered defenses, and dig in for the cold weather ahead. To be fair, the Ukrainians have surprised skeptics, but given that they have now squeezed Russia out of its most vulnerable positions, the next steps could be harder. There is some truth to this paragraph from this article, in that the Russians have now tightened up their defenses, and whatever victories Ukraine achieved, if you want to call them victories, in Kherson and Kharkiv, well, now they're going to have a really hard time going head on towards Russian defenses. There is some truth to this paragraph. Remember, even in Kherson, no matter how difficult the supply lines and the situation was in Kherson on the west bank of the Dnipro, every time the Ukraine military tried to attack Kherson, the Russians successfully repelled it every single time, and the Ukraine military suffered terrible losses in the Kherson direction. But this article does hint, it alludes to the fact that Russia is now much better prepared in their new defensive lines, in their new positions. Of course, the article fails to mention that while Ukraine may go on the offensives, the article fails to mention that offensives work both ways, and it is now the Russians who are advancing on most fronts in the Donbass, specifically in Bakhmut. But the article just skips over that. It just talks about Ukraine's ability to mount offensives. Once again, if you call Kharkov and Kherson an offensive. Anyway, number two, the second key challenge facing the Biden White House. How likely is escalation? Yes, the Putin is a madman challenge. Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons to hold 5 regions he has illegally annexed since 2014. Ukraine has walked right over those red lines in eastern Ukraine and Kherson. Yet Crimea, remember Crimea fixation, yet Crimea is more central to Putin's narrative and Russian resurrection. Its loss could undermine his political prestige more seriously than any prior reversal. So recent events haven't fully quieted those within the administration who think an imperfect peace may be preferable to even a slight risk of catastrophe. Once again, it is Crimea. You got those HIMARS in position. Now Ukraine can launch those HIMARS against Crimea. And what is the challenge that the Biden White House faces? Well, if Ukraine, in all of its military superiority, thanks to the U.S. weapons, the article has to plug the military-industrial complex. It has to do a bit of marketing as well. But thanks to those HIMARS, the superior Ukraine military can now begin to take on Crimea. Can now begin to strike at Crimea. And if the Ukraine military decides to do this, of course, this will threaten Putin's power. And the challenge that the Biden White House has in front of it is that as Ukraine dismantles Crimea and moves towards Crimea, Putin might use a nuke. And that is a challenge that the Biden White House has to take seriously. They have to manage Ukraine's military superiority and their desire to take Crimea back with Putin's political position in Russia and the fact that he may use nuclear weapons to hold on to that position. That is the conundrum that grand chess master Biden faces. The third challenge that the Biden White House faces is, will the pro-Ukraine coalition hold together? The European allies have mostly been solid. Ukrainian victories have likely ensured international support through the winter. Candid observers, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, acknowledge that Putin has shown no interest in compromise. Okay. Yet Biden's team still aims to avoid a scenario in which Ukraine is seen to be blocking diplomacy as Europe, deprived of Russian energy supplies, suffers an economically punishing winter. The White House may also be concerned about what a Republican-led House of Representatives will mean for America's position on Ukraine aid come next year. This is why the administration urged Zelensky to retreat from his earlier statements that Ukraine would only negotiate with the next leader of Russia, which had effectively made regime change in Moscow a Western war aim. Still is a Western war aim. It is the number one aim of the collective West. If Ukraine wants the support necessary to win the war, it must show that it is open to negotiating an end to it. So basically, they're talking about EU Ukraine fatigue, which is a serious disease, a very serious ailment, Ukraine fatigue. And if anyone is suffering from Ukraine fatigue, I recommend 2 Zelensky tablets. You can get them at any local pharmacy, or even better, you can get the Zelensky medication in powder form. Usually it's taken via the nostrils. It's inhaled via the nose. So anyone suffering from Ukraine fatigue, that's all you have to do. Visit your local pharmacy and they'll be able to take care of it right away. But this article, this paragraph is just basically talking about Europe's Ukraine fatigue. It mentions that Europe has been cut off from Russian energy. It fails to mention that it was the Biden policy of sanctioning Russia that Europe actually agreed to, that has led to Europe being cut off from Russian energy. So it was on the, let's say, the recommendations, and I'm being very kind, the recommendations of the United States, that Europe agreed to cut itself off from Russian energy. And this article fails to mention that when Europe was reconsidering its position with regards to cutting itself off of Russian energy, specifically Russian gas, specifically Germany, well then they just blew apart the Nord Stream 1 and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This article fails to mention that, but either way, a challenge that the United States and Golden Boy Anthony Blinken-face is keeping Europe invested in Project Ukraine, while at the same time the United States deindustrializes and subjugates Europe. That is the challenge that they face. How do you keep Europe invested in this project, while at the same time, how do you hollow out Europe and deindustrialize the entire continent and completely subjugate them to the U.S.'s control, to the U.S.'s rule? So that was the third challenge faced by the Biden White House. And of course, they also talk about how it's Zelensky that wants it's Zelensky that is trying for some peace, but it's Russia that doesn't show a willingness to negotiate. So they had to throw that in there as well. Finally, the final key challenge that the Biden White House faces is, does a protracted conflict help or hurt the U.S.? If this war has imposed terrible costs on Ukraine, it has been a strategic windfall for Washington. Russia's military is being reduced to rubble. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is expanding and strengthening its defenses. China is facing greater resistance in the Western Pacific as Japan, Taiwan, and Australia hasten their military preparations. European nations that now see the downsides of dependence on one coercive autocracy are reconsidering their ties with another, Beijing. Amid Putin's serial struggles in Ukraine, assertive authoritarianism no longer looks like the wave of the future. Yet key officials wonder whether the U.S. has already reaped all the advantages the Ukraine war has to offer. As time passes, the cost may get higher in distraction from other regions and scarce munitions consumed invulnerability to crises that break out elsewhere. So these final two paragraphs, what they're basically saying is that the Biden White House, if it wants to take up Bloomberg, if it wants to take Bloomberg up on its offer, it can easily package the last 9 months in Ukraine and the last 97 billion that has been spent in Ukraine. It can package it up as one big, massive foreign policy win for the Biden White House. NATO is stronger than ever. Russia is weaker than ever. Russia is in tatters. It is in tatters. The Pacific is now more united and stronger than ever so that they can face China, Japan, Taiwan, Australia. They're all ready to now inflict the same damage that Ukraine inflicted on Russia. They are ready to inflict that damage now onto China. And Europe, the EU, is now 100% free of not only Russian energy and Russian commodities, but they are now freeing themselves from China as well, which would mean that Europe is going to be 100% dependent on the United States. And Bloomberg says that this is all one big sign, one big signal that neoliberalism is alive and well, globalism is alive and well. And what does Bloomberg say? It says that assertive authoritarianism no longer looks like the wave of the future. In other words, Eurasia, BRICS, all of that is over. It's done. Biden killed it. Biden destroyed it. This is the genius of Joe Bidenopolis, Greece's favorite son. He has destroyed this wave of authoritarianism. This fair world order is over and done with. So that is the victory that Biden can declare. And of course, the article also says that you might as well declare a W, Biden, because the more this drags on, the more the United States is running out of weapons and munitions. So I don't know how they square the circle with this is a full spectrum victory, but we're also running out of weapons, so you better get out of this Ukraine conflict right away. And it mentions that the United States simply does not have the resources to fight multiple wars or multiple regime change projects, to undertake multiple regime change projects. So perhaps the 97 billion Ukraine project griff is more than enough, and it's time to move on to a new regime change project. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Taiwan, whatever, maybe a different country or a different region that we haven't thought of just yet. But this article is saying that as time passes, the costs may get higher in distraction from other regions and in vulnerability to crises that break out elsewhere. In other words, let's move on to the next thing. Let's move on to the next grift. We've done really well on that thing a year or two ago. We've done really well on this thing. It's time to move on to the next thing. That's basically what the article is saying. Let's call it a W. Let's chalk up a win. It's a victory. Here's how you do it, Biden White House. Time to move on to the next project. So let's do a clown world and we will wrap this video up. And remember, my clown world is connected to girl power. And this clown world and this girl power is courtesy of author Stephen King and a tweet he sent out a couple of days ago. He says, if a woman was in charge of Russia instead of the testosterone-fueled current leader, the war in Ukraine would be over by New Year's Day, and we could all breathe a little easier. Girl power, courtesy of horror book author Stephen King. Yeah, he was the same guy that got pranked by Vovan and Lexus, wasn't he? And when he was getting prank called by Vovan and Lexus, he was gushing about how cool Bandera was. He was all in with Bandera. That's Stephen King, which goes to show that you can be absolutely brilliant at one thing, like writing horror books, but a complete nitwit when it comes to everything else. That is Stephen King. Anyway, I will leave the video there, theduran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin as well. Go to the Duran shop. Where is it here? Right there. 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.